How did Ripple secretly pay banks to forget about XRP? The truth is uglier than you think. For years, the XRP world repeats one comforting line. Banks will adopt it, and price will follow. It sounds clean, institutional, inevitable. But the part most people do not say out loud is this. Banks do not believe in tokens. They buy what reduces cost, risk, or friction. And if something does not move fast enough, you do not inspire them with vision. You incentivize them. In crypto, that word is a polite suit over a very human mechanism. Pay people to behave as if adoption is real. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable. Ripple builds a payments network. Ripple also holds a massive amount of XRP. Ripple's public narrative is simple. XRP is utility, a bridge asset for cross-border payments. But utility has a problem. Utility needs volume. Volume needs participants. And participants need a reason to show up now, not someday. So Ripple does what many networks do when they are trying to create momentum. It creates programs that push usage. In 2017, Ripple announces what it calls an accelerator program, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of XRP set aside for customers. Not charity, not community generosity, a structured system of rebates and marketing incentives tied to integration and volume milestones. It is designed to make using the network financially attractive at the exact moment when organic demand is still weak. And that is the first crack in the myth. Because if adoption were naturally exploding, you would not need to pay people to generate it. Now, the XRP community hears incentives and thinks normal business. But step back and look at what it does psychologically. When you see partners and institutions and integration, your brain translates it as legitimacy. When you hear volume milestones, your brain imagines real demand. And when you watch press releases stack up, you stop asking the simplest question. Who is paying to make this look like it is working? The most famous case is MoneyGram. Ripple and MoneyGram enter a partnership, and it is framed as validation, a major remittance company using Ripple's tech. Ripple invests in the company. The story writes itself. Real rails, real business, real adoption. But then disclosures land like a cold object in your stomach. MoneyGram reports receiving large incentive payments in XRP connected to the relationship, tens of millions over time, including figures like over $16 million in one quarter and over $15 million in another. And here is the detail that ruins the fairy tale for anyone paying attention. MoneyGram also discloses that a meaningful portion of the benefit is not XRP magically saving costs. It is XRP being handed to them. Incentives, credits, support. That is not a crime, but it is a truth. And the truth is this. The adoption story is partly financed. Now imagine you are a retail holder watching from the outside. You hear enterprise partnership and you assume they must be buying XRP because they need it. You do not instinctively assume they might be receiving XRP to make the numbers work. This is where the word bribe shows up in people's mouths. Not because it is literally a brown envelope across a table, but because it triggers the same moral feeling. Someone is being paid to act convinced. And it gets worse when you understand how incentives interact with the market. If a company receives XRP as part of a commercial agreement, what can it do with it? It can hold it or it can sell it. So the same token used to demonstrate usage can become supply that leaks back into the market. That does not mean every partner dumps. It does not mean every deal is fake. It means the loop is messy. To create adoption, you subsidize. To subsidize, you distribute. To distribute, you increase the pressure of supply. Now at a second layer, optics. Ripple publishes transparency reports and talks about ecosystem growth. It also has to convince markets that XRP demand is real. In the regulator complaint, authorities allege Ripple distributed XRP in exchange for services like labor and market making, and that Ripple's efforts were central to building the ecosystem and demand narrative. Allegations are not verdicts, but the pattern they point to is familiar in crypto. When an ecosystem is not self-sustaining yet, someone has to manufacture the conditions that look like sustainability. And market-making services is one of those phrases that sounds technical until you translate it into plain English. Someone helps keep a market liquid, active, and tradable. And that activity can feel like organic interest even when it is paid for. This is the hidden trade-off most people never mention when they say banks will adopt XRP. Banks do not adopt narratives. They adopt incentives. And incentives are not free. Someone pays them. So who pays? Ripple pays, directly or indirectly, because Ripple benefits from the perception that XRP is becoming unavoidable. The network becomes more credible. The token becomes more defensible. The community's patience gets rewarded with a story that continues. That is why the myth never sell is so powerful inside XRP culture. It is not just a strategy. It is identity. It turns holding into virtue. But here is the uncomfortable psychological twist. The longer you hold, the more you need the story to be true. Because if you admit the adoption you believed in was partly subsidized, you do not just lose money. You lose meaning. You lose years of confidence. You lose the feeling that you were early and right. And that is exactly why incentives work so well. Not because they fool regulators. Not because they magically change reality. Because they feed the emotional engine of the community, validation. Even the tech side has this duality. On-demand liquidity is real, using XRP as a bridge asset to source liquidity in real time instead of pre-funding accounts. The pitch is clean, speed, cost, efficiency. But the business reality is brutal. Liquidity does not appear because a token has a good mission statement. Liquidity appears because someone is paid to provide it, or because traders see profit in doing it. So when Ripple offers rebates and incentives to increase volume, it is trying to kickstart the very thing that the narrative claims should happen naturally. This is the part that creates the faint taste of disgust. Not because incentives are inherently evil, but because they are often presented as proof of genuine demand, when they are actually a substitute for it. It is like paying people to stand in line outside a restaurant so passers-by think it is popular. The food might be good, the restaurant might survive, but the line is still staged. And then, when regulators enter the picture, everything gets louder. In December 2020, regulators charged Ripple and two executives, alleging unregistered securities offerings and pointing to Ripple's role in promoting and selling XRP. Years later, the case becomes one of the most important legal fights in crypto, with a major court decision in July 2023 and continued legal battles afterward. But for a holder, the legal details blur into a single emotion, uncertainty. And uncertainty makes people cling harder to simple beliefs. That is why banks are coming becomes almost religious. It is easier than admitting you are exposed to a long, complicated, incentive-driven struggle between a company, regulators, markets, and narratives. So what is the truth behind the hook? Not a cartoon conspiracy where Ripple slips cash to bankers in dark rooms. Something more banal, more corporate, more realistic, more unsettling. Ripple builds adoption the way many companies do, through strategic incentives, rebates, partnerships, and financial support tied to usage and integration. And that means the bank adoption narrative is not purely the market voting. It is partly a company investing in the conditions that make adoption possible or at least visible. The trade-off is simple. If incentives succeed, the ecosystem becomes real over time. If incentives fail, what looked like momentum can evaporate the moment the subsidies stop. And that is why it can feel disgusting. Because the myth people want is clean. XRP pays for itself through utility. But the reality is messy. Utility is expensive to bootstrap, and someone funds the bootstrap. So when you hear Ripple partnered with someone, you have to ask a harder question than most videos do. Was it adoption, or was it an incentive program doing its job? Because those two can look identical in a headline. They can look identical in a chart. They can look identical in a community that desperately needs them to be identical. And that is the circle we close back to. How did Ripple secretly pay banks to forget about XRP? By not calling it paying. By calling it accelerators, rebates, incentives, partnership support. The truth is not that XRP has no future. The truth is uglier. Sometimes the loudest proof of adoption is just a bill being paid, so you stop asking why the adoption needed funding in the first place.